And we are live. Really excited to welcome another fabulous presentation to the Diana Initiative. But before I do that, before I introduce our speakers, I want to give a couple of announcements. First, I want to thank our sponsors. So all of these sponsors have made it possible for us to be here today, to be able to get in either free or for very low. So we definitely appreciate our sponsors. I want to let you know, give you a couple announcements that the Career Village has a raffle for courses, the eLearn security courses. So stop on into the Career Village. It's in the sessions area. So I'm very pleased and delighted to welcome our next speakers. I will let you know that I'll be collecting Q&A out of the main room. So if you get questions, just type those into the stage chat area, and we'll get those to Brianna and to Laura. So delighted to welcome a presentation called College Students Driving Digital Crash Reconstruction. I'd like to introduce Ms. Brianna Drummond. Brianna is a senior undergrad at the University of Notre Dame studying political science and Russian with a minor in cyber safety and security. In addition to being a student, Brianna is a senior investigator for the St. Joseph County Cyber Crimes Unit. She also holds an MCFE Magnet Certified Forensic Examiner certification. In her role with the Cyber Crimes Unit, Brianna co-founded and taught at the first Women in Forensics camp for high school girls last summer. In her free time, Brianna loves doing yoga, going for walks while listening to How I Built This with Guy Raz and baking. Next, I'd like to introduce Laura Hernandez. Laura is a senior undergraduate at the University of Notre Dame studying sociology with a minor in cyber safety and security. She's currently a senior investigator in the St. Joseph County Cyber Crimes Unit in Indiana, where she works as a digital forensic examiner. She is also certified as a Magnet Certified Forensics Examiner through Magnet Forensics. In the summer of 2019, she co-founded Women in Forensics, a week-long day camp that introduced local high school girls to the DFIR and InfoSec world. If she's not in the cyber crimes unit, Laura loves to box, yay, Notre Dame boxing, women's boxing, and go hiking, camping, and cook. So thanks so much, and we really look forward to a great presentation.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. And I will share my screen now. So should be working. Okay. Okay, so thank you so much for introducing us. The title of our talk today, as I'm sure most of you know, is College Students Driving Digital Crash Reconstruction. And this is the research topic that Laura and I have been doing in our work with the St. Joseph County Cyber Crimes Unit, Digital Crash Reconstruction. And to begin talking about this research, I'm going to start with why we thought of this. So the nature of crime has been changing, and this is because of technology, the advancement in technology, and also the increasing use of technology. And this crime kind of encompasses that crime has been changing and police agencies need to catch up. And our cyber crimes unit, we do a lot of work with digital evidence, and something that we've even noticed over the years is that while technology is increasing and the use is increasing, this has enabled new methods to commit old crimes and also new crimes to commit. So I have here examples of ransomware. I have a little cryptocurrency graphic there to talk about Bitcoin scams as well. And then also in the left-hand image, you can see that there's a lot of mobile devices that came along with this evidence. So crime has really been changing with this increasing use of technology. And because of this, like the last quote said, police agencies really need to catch up, but this is something that is a difficulty for large departments. It says here in this quote, there are large digital evidence backlogs, limited equipment, and potential turnover of examiners through frustration or even being promoted out of the unit. And we actually experienced this before we had our cyber crimes unit. This little box of phones, this actually demonstrates the turnover and also the overwhelming nature of digital evidence, because this box of phones was actually just sitting underneath one of our examiners' desks who actually transferred to a different department. And that's when we really noticed, and it's a really clear visual, how overwhelming all this digital evidence is, and that the number and the size of digital evidence is only going to keep increasing. And I have 3 bullets here that are kind of as a result of that. So only major cases are getting forensic attention, and the average case turnaround is actually 6 to 8 months, sometimes over a year, and sometimes never. And this is actually a unique aspect of our unit, our backlog, and I'm sure Laura will touch on that in the future. But our unit has actually kind of answered this, or tried to answer this problem that police agencies are having. So these 2 headlines and articles kind of talk a lot about what I was mentioning in the last slide, but law enforcement has been overwhelmed by digital data, and police forces therefore need to reimagine how they're policing and how they're dealing with this digital evidence in this increasingly technical and digital age. So this little highlighted part here says they must be strategic in their approaches to technology, talent, and partnerships. And as was mentioned with our introductions, Laura and I are both students, but we're also investigators for a cybercrimes unit. And that was one way that Notre Dame and the St. Joseph County Cybercrimes Unit were strategic with their partnerships and their approach.
So I'm going to talk a little bit more about our specific solution to this problem of overwhelming digital data. So what we did is we partnered the University of Notre Dame with the St. Joseph County Cybercrimes Unit, which works under the St. Joseph County Prosecutor's Office. And it started out small. It started out with just 1 student working as a digital forensic examiner for the unit, just as an internship to see if it would work out. And to this day, we have 16 students working in the unit. So in the next slide, you'll see what makes our unit unique is that we're actually sworn in with full law enforcement and police powers. And this is a picture from one of our swearing-ins that just shows the unique nature of our unit. While there are so many other units in the country that work with college students, we're one of the only ones that really give students these powers. And what that does is that it takes away any obstacles that there may be during an investigation. We have the power to write and execute search warrants. We have the power to work on open cases and look at evidence, and even go to crime scenes to collect evidence. So all of those are kind of the factors that make our unit unique, and one of the examples of a strategic partnership that can tackle this amount of data. So in this slide, you can see on the left a picture from a swearing-in from 2016, where there were only 3 students working in this partnership. On the right, you can see a photo from this year's swearing-in, which you can tell it's from this year because of the 6 feet of space between students and the masks to comply with COVID regulations. But you can see how much the unit has expanded and grown in just the last 4 years. And another very unique thing about our unit is the ratio of males to females, because in a field where it has been pretty much male dominated for the past, and we haven't had a lot of women in STEM in the InfoSec and DFIR fields, our unit has 15 females and 1 male. So this is extremely unique, and we found that it's just because maybe more women apply, but they also have a better grasp on the analysis that needs to be done in the unit. So I'll tell you a little bit more about what the unit looks like on a day-to-day. So we are, as I said, sworn in as investigators by the prosecutor. We work an average of 10 to 15 hours per week, depending on our experience level, depending on how much we're willing to work, and our other responsibilities as college students. And while we're there, we work on all law enforcement cases. So this can be anything from homicides and assaults, such as like violent crime, to drug offenses and fraud, to domestic violence and traffic crashes. But the one thing that we don't work on, well, 2 things, I guess, are child sexual abuse materials and cases involving Notre Dame students and on Notre Dame's campus. The first is to protect us from the sort of material that may be a little more difficult to work with. And the second is just so there's no conflict of interest on any cases that we work. For these cases, we conduct digital forensics examinations, and we also write and execute search warrants, whether that be to cloud or just to examine and search mobile devices. And I'll share with you a few photos of what our life looks like in the unit. Here's a photo of us just on a daily basis conducting forensic examinations at our desks, followed by us eating donuts. So yes, we are cops. We will follow the stereotype. If you bring us donuts, we will not complain. We eat donuts a lot. We also teach forensics, and as we are so kindly introduced, we also co-founded a camp called Women in Forensics that introduced local high school girls to COSEC fields, and we got to teach, each of us taught modules on different aspects of the digital forensics process. And we also process crime scenes. If there's a case that we're working on from the very beginning, we are the ones that can go on scene to actually collect the digital evidence that we will then examine. But at the same time, we're also normal college students. We go to tailgates, we go to football games, we undertake a full course load, and we just live our normal lives. We just happen to have the additional responsibilities of working as sworn law enforcement officers and digital forensic examiners.
So going a little bit onward about our role in the unit. So like Laura mentioned, we do a lot of different things. A large percentage of that are the digital forensic examinations that we conduct. And we also have research on the side. So I mentioned Laura and I's research is digital crash reconstruction, what our talk is on today. And has been evolving in that there are new ways to commit crimes and also new crimes to commit, then enabled new methods of investigation on our side. So while typical physical crash reconstruction will look like the graphic on the right, we've been doing some digital crash reconstruction, and Laura and I were really curious to learn more about how we could gather speed and GPS location data from phones. And we'll talk more about our testing. I wanted to talk about physical crash reconstruction, what that's all about, and kind of comparing that later on to digital crash reconstruction. So physical crash reconstruction is when reconstruction officers will go to a crash scene and they will try to figure out these main three variables. So the entry angle, the departure angle, and this F variable is the drag factor, the stickiness of the road. So in trying to determine these entry and departure angles, as well as the drag factor, once they have a number for those three items, they will plug them into formulas, calculations, and those formulas and calculations will spit out a range for a specific speed that the vehicle might have been at. And while that's all great that they're applying all these formulations and calculations, we kind of noticed that it was a little bit subjective, and we wondered if there wasn't a more concrete, less subjective way to determine that. And while we're doing crash reconstruction, additionally, while the time of the crash is really important, we also wondered, well, what were they doing a few hours before? A big question is, what were they doing obviously on their in the crash too, but then were they drinking beforehand? Were they tired beforehand? And the way that we frame our investigations now with digital crash reconstruction, in addition to physical crash reconstruction, is we break it kind of into, so pre-collision in terms of a few hours before, what was the person doing that day, looking at just before the crash as well as the crash itself, and then post-collision. And we found that considering all questions in those 3 times kind of help us have a more full investigation rather than looking at just the point of impact and just these 3 main variables. So that's what we'll go into now. So some questions we would ask for physical crash reconstruction, I kind of mentioned some earlier, but were any of the drivers consuming alcohol? Had any driver been on the road a long time or fatigued from their long drive? Where were they prior to the collision in general? Were they at a friend's house? Were they at Domino's, Pizza Hut, whatever? These are possible questions we would have. Some sources of information then are suspect and witness statements or interviews and CCTV footage. And while CCTV footage will likely give a pretty good, accurate picture, we wondered how we could verify what witness or suspect said about beforehand. And some other questions we would ask, so moving on to immediately pre-collision and collision, are how fast were the vehicles traveling? What directions were they moving collision? What caused them to collide? In what directions did they travel after the collision? And then where did the vehicles come to rest? And the sources of information to answer these questions, there's actually several. So the traffic collision report, we could do vehicle inspection based on photographs of the vehicles or looking at the vehicles themselves at the scene. And one thing that we mentioned here, outside elements in the car, if you look at this first picture, What this would look like is if a car had toppled over or rotated several times onto a grassy patch, for example. If the car was upright after the collision, but we saw grass in one of the doors or near the top of the car, we might be able to see, oh, maybe this car had rotated, maybe it was stuck in the grass for a second or two. And then another thing we can look at with vehicle inspection is the crush patterns on the vehicle. Additionally, we can look at the collision scene and determine if there are skid marks, yaw marks, gouge marks to show the vehicle components interacting with the roadway. And the yaw marks are slip slide marks, and these are important because most vehicles do have anti-lock brakes, and it might be difficult then to determine the skid mark. So it's important to look at all these different, I have 3 listed here, these different marks at the collision to determine what the vehicle was doing with the road. Similar to the first questions that we asked, some sources of information are interviews with suspects and victims or statements from witnesses. And then lastly, an additional thing are the medical records, including autopsy reports. So there are several different sources of information for this immediately pre-collision and collision. But some problems with immediately pre-collision and collision questions and determining if the sources of information are accurate is, again, the subjectivity. It's just based on analysis. And another really important thing to consider is what if the evidence isn't available? If there's a hit and run, for example, we can't do any vehicle inspection. We would just have to look at one vehicle or just the roadway. And the road surface also might change. That could be another way that the evidence wouldn't be available if, for example, earlier rain had dried or ice had melted. And then the same problem we had with the immediately pre-collision and the pre-collision questions, just the pre-collision questions, was there's no way to verify witness statements or interviews with victims and suspects. So it's all kind of subjective, and we wanted to, like I said, figure out if we could have a more concrete answer to these questions. And then post-collision, we're also going to look at, was the collision hit and run again, because that could be important for where the vehicle that we want to look at went or where that suspect went. And where did the suspect go? Like I just mentioned, sources of information are also similar to pre-collision, suspect interviews, witness statements, CCTV footage. And like I said earlier, CCTV footage will likely be pretty reliable, but how can any statements or interviews be completely verified?
So to answer this question, we decided to use what we had, which was digital evidence from mobile devices, and see if we could apply any of that evidence to the problems that we named of physical crash reconstruction. And in general, we formulated a plan for digital crash reconstruction that basically planned to use digital evidence to reconstruct the evidence prior to, during, and after a vehicle collision. So I'll go through the same steps that Brianna did with digital crash reconstruction. But first, we had to do a little bit of testing to see if the data from mobile devices was accurate, whether it was available, when it was available, and how it could be used in cases. The first testing that we did was of speed data. And we did this because we found that we were getting speed data on some iOS device digital extractions, but not others. And we wanted to figure out why this was the case and what was the pattern behind when we got speed data and when we didn't. So we went for a drive. We logged every speed we were going at, every route we took, and what applications we were using on the phone at the time. So here's an example of when we were using text messaging on the phone. So the first box, labeled number 1, you see that the application intent is messages, and application intent and application focus are both knowledge seed database artifacts from iOS devices that basically show the application that was up on the screen on the phone and in primary use at the time by the phone user. So text messaging was opened, and then we immediately get a location artifact labeled number 2, and then later number 3, we get a third cache location, and then the screen turns off. At no point in this time did we get any speed data. We only got cache locations, no speed, just coordinates. To contrast this, we then tested Snapchat, because a lot of the phones that we were getting from younger users and users in general, we were finding a lot of Snapchat usage even during driving. So again, very similar to text messaging. Box number 1, we found the use of Snapchat as the application focus, still in the knowledge seed database. And that package name just is associated with Snapchat, although it doesn't have the exact same name. Again, number 2 is the first cache location after Snapchat was opened on the phone, just coordinates, no speeds yet. But then we see something different. In box number 3, it pulls the keychain and permissions for Snapchat. And in box number 4, we start getting a cache location with speed. And this was compared with more information on each of the artifacts. And this one actually did provide a speed in meters per second. So we thought, great, what other apps can we find? And we tested, I'll show you one more example before we get into our findings. The next example was taking a picture. Same thing, box number 1, application focus is the camera app. Box number 2, we have a cache location with no speed recorded. But then in box number 3, we do have speed. And so very much like Snapchat, there is a couple seconds of delay between the time that the application is opened and the time that we get speed logged with the application. So what did we find overall in this testing? We found, first, that GPS locations and speeds are collected every second when using Snapchat, Google Maps, camera, phone calls, and weather. There may be other apps, but these are the ones we tested that had speeds. For the applications that do collect speeds, there is, like I said, a 3 to 5 second delay between the time the application is opened and the time that speed is collected. Then, GPS locations with no speeds are collected every second when using apps like text messages and Safari. Again, no speeds on these. Lastly, when there is no activity on the phone, locations are collected on average approximately every 15 seconds. No speeds, just locations at 15-second intervals. So we were seeing if we could find a pattern for why some of these applications collected speed data and some didn't. And the ones that I listed earlier that did collect speed, you can find a lot of them under these location services permissions. These are the ones boxed out in red: camera, Google Maps, Snapchat, and weather. And what these all have in common is that they all have location services permissions enabled while using the application. So in the camera app, for example, this is the same screenshot I showed earlier, that it does have permissions for location, and therefore we did get speed. So how can we apply this research, this information that we've gained to our actual cases? This is intended to make our casework and investigations more accurate. So same questions that Brianna asked. Where were the drivers? Were they consuming alcohol? How long had they been driving? And these questions, which we formerly could only get the answers to through interviews or CCTV footage, now we have new information. We have geolocation data. We have text messages, photos, videos. We have application focus, application usage, as I was showing earlier. But now we encounter new problems, which is that the data is not always available, depending on the make, the model, and the state of phones. Because we're working vehicle collisions, it's very likely that the phones will be damaged. And if they're damaged beyond being able to access the screen, we likely will not be able to get any information off of them. Likewise, if the phone is locked because the owner is deceased, again, because these are vehicle collisions, it's likely that we won't be able to have enough data like the location database to perform this type of analysis. This is an example of a case in which we used the same framework, this same theory of digital crash reconstruction with a different type of case. So this is an incident in which we only had a victim testimony to what happened, as well as a video of the incident in which we couldn't find any location information, but we had no other evidence to support or deny her story. So this is some excerpts from my investigative report for this case. And first I show that there's a picture on the victim's phone that she took of a cup on a bar top. It's a pretty unique bar top. So I looked up Google Images and user contributed images of the bar that she said that she was at. And I found a user contributed image on Google Maps of the same exact bar top. So I confirmed that she was in fact at this bar called Smith's at 6:35 p.m. on the date of the incident. I then went on and looked at other artifacts. She sent a message to a contact with the last name Davis, stating that she was at Smith's, confirming her earlier photo at around 7:30 that same night. She then tells the contact that she walked across the street at 8 p.m. And then at 8:42, she tells her mother that she's getting dinner at Smith's. So she's in this same area. We have text to confirm it. We have photos to confirm it. And we have a couple more images that I'll show you on the next slide. We also found that she took this picture very early in the morning after the incident had happened of these double doors that I then found on Google Street View to match these doors at Rock Sports Cafe, which is also in the same block as Smith's downtown. So we have all of this data confirming the location, but we also needed to address the video that she took of the incident. And what I did on this case was I went into the hex code and saw if I could find any coordinates in the metadata of the video. And I was able to find these coordinates. I mapped them out, and as shown in the next slide, they mapped exactly to Smith's downtown, the location where she said that the incident had occurred. So before using this framework of reconstructing an incident using digital data, all we had was victim testimony. But by using all these types of artifacts, photos, videos, locations, I was able to corroborate her story, add a lot of evidence that supported her claim, and build a more coherent story of her entire night leading up to the incident and following the incident.
So Laura just gave a really great example of the pre-collision and, like she said, telling the story of where that person went. And we'll kind of look also at that further and look and at the collision itself. So looking at the questions that we're adding on to, in addition to the physical crash reconstruction questions, we'll add, was the driver distracted by notification, perhaps on their mobile device? Was the driver actively using a mobile device at the time of collision? And we have another case example for this kind of set of questions as well. So the sources of information are similar to those that Laura mentioned: geolocation data, speed data, text messages, application usage, network data usage, photos, videos. And I'll just kind of talk about these images I have here on the screen. The message on the far right is actually a pretty good example of what Laura was talking about kind of a few hours before the collision. And a user texts our suspect and says, "No, can you come get it tonight?" And then the suspect responds, "I'll be drunk." And that was several hours before the crash occurred, but just something to consider and something that I tagged that might have been relevant. And then in these photos in the middle, these are actually some of them are screenshots of videos, but these videos actually depicted the suspect or the person that was in the passenger seat, and they were kind of screaming, laughing, and the vehicle, you could see it veering on and off the road. And these were, like I said, both photos and videos. And then in the bottom picture, we have this peekaboo, which is Snapchat, as Laura kind of talked about. And they were opening Snapchat just moments before the incident, the collision occurred. And so I wondered then, was speed collected? And while speed was collected at that time, we got some good speed data for the time of the incident. There also was a really good example of the speed being recorded with Snapchat use from earlier in the night. So this was an hour or so before the collision occurred. And the left-hand side is a picture of a Snapchat memories video. And the video, there's a little red box, it was 2 seconds long. And then it was created at 10:19 and 4 seconds on the night of the incident. And like I said, this was a 2-second Snapchat video. You can see in this video that the speedometer reads 140 miles per hour. And I wanted to see if we could confirm that. I knew from our research that Snapchat does collect speed data. So I started looking at the cache locations and seeing what speeds were associated with that time. And looking at 10:19 and 1 second to 10:19 and 4 seconds, we can see that in the first little piece of data, 62.45 meters per second, that's actually converted to 139.7 miles per hour. So at the beginning, when this video was taken, the vehicle was likely traveling around 140 miles per hour. And then we can see that the speed slowly decreases. In the video, when you play it too, you can see the speedometer, it'll kind of go a little bit below 140 miles per hour. But that was a really great way that we could see, kind of based on our research, Snapchat was recording speed data. I applied it to one of the cases that we were working. And then now looking at post-collision, the questions are similar to those that we asked for physical crash reconstruction. Was the collision a hit and run? Where did the suspect go after the collision? And sources of information also very similar to those previously mentioned: photos, videos, text messages, geolocation data. But the problems still are the same in that the data might not always be available depending on the make, model, state of phones, as Laura mentioned beforehand. But we do have an example here of some events post-collision. So this is another case example. This was a vehicle pursuit, and it was a hit and run, actually. So that was a really good example for us to consider if we could see where the suspect or the vehicle went after the crash occurred. So you can see that the first bullet point here, the first little dot of information here is 97 miles per hour. And as the suspect continues traveling east, their speed is decreasing, and then they approach this intersection and kind of veer off to the left, going from 28 miles per hour to a hard 0 miles per hour. And that's also shown in the little Excel spreadsheet area in the left-hand side of the photo at the bottom. So then where did they go after that? This was a hit and run, as I mentioned. Well, the suspect actually was fleeing on foot, and in the speeds here, you can see it's a range from 1 to 4 miles per hour. The suspect, like I said, was fleeing on foot, and we were actually able to look at where they went. So they ran to a residence where they remained, where the red dots are here in this little residence. They remained there for the next few hours, and we were able to see with both the speeds that they were going and that they ended up at a residence that they were running from the scene of the crime. And like I said, we have a few different case examples. This is all dependent on the data that you would get, the data that would be available based on the device and the state of the device and what apps they were using.
So after all these examples and all these explanations, I just want to summarize a little bit the difference between physical and digital crash reconstruction, so you can compare the methods, the success of each of these methods. So for physical crash reconstruction, it uses physics and engineering principles to infer events prior to crash. And this is done by trained reconstructionists using well-refined calculations. But digital reconstruction uses data retrieved from phones to objectively show events that happened prior to a crash. On one hand, physical reconstruction uses evidence such as skid marks, road surface, and damage to vehicles, in addition to witness and suspect statements, while digital crash reconstruction uses digital evidence such as geolocation data, application usage, and speed artifacts, along with photos and videos to construct the story of before, during, and after a collision. While the accuracy of physical crash reconstruction depends on subjective judgments and the accuracy of these calculations, we found that the digital evidence that we've pulled from mobile devices to reconstruct collisions has been highly accurate in cases when it's available, in the speed being down to the meters per second, as Brianna showed. And lastly, while the evidence for physical reconstructions are easily accessible at the site of the crash, we do have the issue of evidence may or may not being accessible on digital crash reconstructions, depending on the state and the make and model of the phone. And going a little further with the limitations, because we have to acknowledge in any research that there's going to be limitations to the research, as well as limitations to the way we can integrate this research into real world cases. And the first problem that we've run into, which I personally was surprised about, was that crash reconstructionists that currently use the method of physical crash reconstruction are not entirely willing to adopt these methods in addition to their own current methods. For example, a reconstructionist from our crash team looked at the case that Brianna was explaining, in which the suspect was traveling 140 miles per hour. And they looked at the evidence and they said, no, this car is too old. It could not be traveling 140 miles per hour, despite the fact that Brianna had both the video of the speedometer as well as the speed data from the phone itself to confirm that the car was traveling 140 miles per hour. So it is difficult to see that in cases where the research applies in a textbook manner and we are able to apply it, that it still won't be adopted. We also run into this problem of the location database on iPhones. As many of you probably know, this is only maintained for 7 days. So if we have reconstructionists that aren't willing to adopt the needs of these methods, they won't bring the phone in within 7 days, and that data will be lost. There's no way we can retrieve that, and a lot of these digital reconstruction methods depend on that location database and that speed database to give us the information that we need. As I mentioned earlier, another limitation is these smashed phones, given the nature of this investigation, phones that are damaged so far beyond repair that we can't get the data that we need from them. And then again, as I said earlier, the deceased owners. If we have no passcode from these owners, the phones may be in before first unlock mode. They may have been powered off, and we are completely unable to get that location database off of that because that is highly protected information. And lastly, the research we've done has only been for iOS devices, given that our interest stemmed from where and when speed data would show up and when it didn't, which is something we were only gathering with the databases on iPhones. However, a lot of our cases in the unit do have Android items of evidence, and we've had a lot of success getting location databases from Google through search warrants. So a lot of these methods could be applied to location databases from Android phones, but our current application of the speed data research is only for iOS devices.
And some of you might be wondering why we don't do vehicle forensics. Why don't we look at the vehicle itself if we're trying to confirm all of these different speeds, the GPS data points? And that's a really great question, but one answer for our unit specifically is just that, like Laura has been mentioning, and like I mentioned in the beginning, we're just using the digital evidence that we're getting from our cases, and we're kind of incorporating it in a zero cost manner. We're incorporating our research and digital crash reconstruction in a zero cost manner to investigate fatal crashes. And while I think vehicle forensics is really interesting, I know I have some pictures here, the Burla IV forensic tool. I know that there are also the event data recorders, the EDRs that I think Bosch has a toolkit for extracting. The EDRs will only record about 5 seconds, I think, before a crash, and then 1 second after. And that's also if an event happens, such as the airbags are used. So that's also really specific and doesn't kind of tell the whole tale that we were talking about earlier. What was hours before, what were they doing 5 minutes before the crash? And the Burla IVE toolkit, I know that does look at the infotainment and telematics system, which I think could be really useful. And kind of what I'm showing in the middle here is I think that would be a really interesting thing to research. And like I mentioned, this is our research, but we can incorporate into our cases. But in the bottom hand image of the no upcoming in destinations, that's Ford Sync, and that was actually my photo. I was driving with my mom in our Ford car, and I took a screenshot on my phone, and I was taking a few screenshots, and I had this screenshot among others in my camera roll, and I was really curious about that. And I wondered if we were doing a digital crash reconstruction and someone drove a Ford, were taking screenshots, would they had a potential upcoming destination, would they have any other information in their camera roll actually from what the Ford Sync was, how the Ford Sync was communicating with their phones? That's something I think could be really interesting. But yeah, the big answer to that question, I guess, for our unit is, while it is a really interesting thing, we are just not buying any extra forensic toolkit to do these investigations. We're incorporating the evidence we already have. And it's also really interesting to research what we can do with what we already have and what affects that data that we can get. And kind of going off of that, what's next? Like I said, vehicle forensics is pretty interesting for me, but we also, Laura and I, have specific goals for our research going forward. So we kind of hinted at these earlier on, but what if Wi-Fi, cellular data, and GPS are turned off? What would that look like then? What if location permissions are turned off? How would this affect speed tracking? And then Laura also alluded to this, Android digital crash reconstruction. Like we mentioned, we were just testing with our own cybercrimes device, our own iOS device that we have, that we communicate with the detectives with. We were doing testing on that, but what we would love to do, Android digital crash reconstruction, as well as more research with the permissions that I mentioned earlier. And then lastly, we really want to work on being able to work with our other agencies, our FACT team, for example, our reconstructionist, to be able to disseminate the information that we get, our digital crash reconstructions, and also to share that with other law enforcement units potentially outside of our area, and to kind of hear what other people are doing, but also disseminate what we're learning, like we said, with the evidence that we're already getting, what we can do with that. So that's kind of what's next on Laura and I's agenda with this research. And with that, I think we have some time for questions, and we would love to answer any questions you guys have. And yeah,
so I'm seeing some questions in the chat also.
Okay.
If we want to do that before our thank yous.
Yeah.
So one of the first questions we got was, are you receiving any college credits for your work? We'll do that one first. So we have the option to either do this internship for college credit or for pay, and that depends on each student in the unit. That is flexible. And then do the academic course for the MCFE, and then it was free to test, but the preparation was through a Notre Dame class. Another question was, well, have you included Android phones in your research? I think we touched on that briefly, both of us. Followed by, how are you able to tell where the person in the hit and run was before you had access to the phone to check on their speed? So actually, this is an interesting case because the driver in question was a young teenager, and after crashing the car, he showed up at school the next day complaining of his arm hurting, and so this alerted the school administration, and they connected them to law enforcement, and that's how they were able to find the kid, because his arm hurt and he went to the nurse. And then Brianna, do you want to take this one? If we have someone who if they wanted to volunteer to help with digital forensic investigation, not being a college student, just a skilled civilian, do you think they'd have a chance of being able to do so?
To volunteer with our digital forensic investigations?
With a law enforcement, with any digital forensic investigation?
Yeah, that definitely varies by state. We're actually working on expanding to the West Coast in California, and I know there's some difficulty there in terms of being sworn in and being able to work cases. But I'm sure that research could be something that you'd be able to do, because you're not looking at casework. Laura and I, like I said, just grabbed our cybercrimes phone and did testing. And if you had access to someone that was willing to, share their forensic product, whatever it was with you, I'm sure that would be something possible. But yeah, Laura and I, like I said, we just took our phone out and went for a drive and just recorded that. So especially the research end, I'm sure, which could be like we mentioned, it could be really integral for future digital forensics investigations.
Is that it for questions?
I think that's it for questions now. While people are potentially thinking about some additional questions, I have I appreciate you already talked about not go after the CAN bus, not to query onboard computers of the cars at this time. Have you this is more and more?
Oh, I think we're all good. Okay, with that, thank you guys so much for attending. And this was really awesome. It was really awesome to do this virtually, even during our school year. Laura and I are both starting our senior year already. So this was really exciting to be able to present virtually to everyone. And we'd be happy to take any questions or just talk about anything. So we have emails listed here, and also our Twitters if you want to DM any of us or do anything like that. That would be great. But yeah, with that, thank you so much. And I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.